Hi everyone, today we are going to be looking at a really important video which is going to be focused on our case study and specifically our tectonic case study. It's really important that you can learn all of the information from these two case studies off by heart so that you can use the evidence, the data, the information for your evidence when it comes to your 6 markers and your 9 markers, and it will just help to solidify all of that information that you have learned about tectonics so far. And the case study is focusing on how do effects and responses to a tectonic hazard vary between two areas of contrasting levels of wealth. And this just basically means we are going to compare a HIC earthquake to an LIC earthquake. And our HIC will be Japan and our LIC is Nepal. And just remember, when you're referring to a country, you can refer to it as an LIC or HIC. If you are talking about a city, cities aren't HICs or LICs because they are cities and not countries, so just be aware of that when you talk about Kobe. If you're going to say HIC, make sure you're saying Japan. So the GCSE syllabus says you can do any tectonic hazard. We are focusing on specifically earthquakes, and we will need to know the primary and secondary effects of both of these earthquakes and the short and long-term responses to both of the earthquakes as well, and see how they differ in a poorer area versus a more wealthy area. So one great revision strategy, which you will have done before many times, is doing revision cue cards. And this is great for case studies because this means you can test yourself, you can get someone else to test you as well, and it keeps all of the information from your case study in one place. So for today's case study, we're going to try and make cue cards to help us to learn the facts, the figures, the data. And I would recommend that you use 2 different colours, one for your HIC and one for your LIC, and it's quite good. It just helps you another element to remember that the pink was LIC, that the blue was HIC, or whichever colours that you've decided to use. So before moving on with the rest of the video, make sure you've got 2 stacks of paper. If you don't have any coloured, it's fine. Maybe you could write in 2 different colours, and just make sure you've got these to hand, ready to make sure that you can make your revision questions and put your answers on the back of them when you come to the end of each section. We need to know the background information for both Japan and Nepal, and we also need to know about the earthquakes and what happened. So in Japan, which is a HIC, and Nepal, which is an LIC, Japan has a GDP per capita of over 39,000 a year, and Nepal has a GDP per capita of about just over 1,000. So that's the average that people will be earning a year in that country. So you can see the big contrast. Japan's earthquake occurred on the 17th of January 1995 in Kobe, 7.4 on the Richter scale, and it occurred at a destructive plate margin where the Philippines, Pacific and Eurasian plates all meet. Another important bit of information is that it occurred at 5:46 a.m, and this means that a lot of people were either asleep or were having breakfast ready to go to work as it was a Tuesday. Nepal's earthquake occurred on the 25th of April in 2015 at 11:26 a.m, and this date was a Saturday, which is quite significant because it means a lot of people were not at work or were not in school and therefore may have avoided further injuries or damages. The epicentre was 60 kilometres from the capital city, Kathmandu. It was a 7.8 on the Richter scale, so quite high, and it occurred at a collision boundary, so where the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate push into each other, collide upwards, where we get fold mountains, and in this case Mount Everest, and this also causes earthquakes. If you want to challenge yourself, you might want to find a bit of additional info for both of the different countries about the location of the epicentres, the HDI, and population numbers that you can contrast further. It's also important to remember that where you're looking on the internet, it may differ what type of data you're getting. So some of the facts and figures may be slightly different depending on the different source it's coming from. So just to give you an example how you can set up your cue cards, you're going to want to put questions on one side, for example, what is my HIC case study, what is the GDP per capita, and then on the other side of your cue card you're going to write down the answers. And this way you can test yourself or someone else can ask you those questions and tell you if you're correct or not. So on one side you're going to have your questions, and then when you turn them around you have your answers. And then make sure you do the same for the contrasting country, so in this case Nepal. Once you've started that, make yourself 2 piles, make sure you've got your HIC case study cue cards together and your LIC case study cue cards together, put them in order, make sure you've written at the bottom if it's LIC or HIC, that way if you mix them up or they get muddled with other case studies, they are all together, you can put them back in their rightful place. And make sure you've given them a little title card so that when you pin them together or if you put an elastic band around them, you know what your case study is. So next up we have our primary effects, the sudden or immediate effects that occurred during the hazard. In Kobe there were over 5,500 deaths, but approximately 35,000 injured. More than 100 buildings were destroyed, especially those older wooden buildings. The Hanshin Expressway collapsed, which was a very large bridge motorway. Numerous bridges were also destroyed. 120 of the 150 quays in the port of Kobe were destroyed due to liquefaction. That's something that you might want to do a bit of additional research around. And 4,000 schools were destroyed. And then in contrast, Nepal had more deaths, over 8,500, approximately 20,000 were injured, which is slightly less than Japan. More than 600,000 structures in Kathmandu, the capital, were damaged or destroyed. 7,000 schools were destroyed, 50% of shops were also destroyed, and roads were blocked by rubble. So you might want to have a think which country had more significant or severe primary effects and to what extent. And then as before, you're going to be doing this in cue cards, so you're going to have the questions on one side and then the answers on the other. And you might just want to also write down if it's a social impact or whether it's an economic impact. In this case, the majority of them are actually social. Once you're done, add them to your HIC Tectonic case study pile and then do the same for the LICs. So question on one side and again the answers on the other. And again, just make sure you're jotting down, is it social, is it economic, is it an environmental effect? It's always good practice just to do this for every sort of effect or response that you look at. So you've seen how I've done it for the background information and the primary effects. Now we're going to move on to the secondary effects, and you can make your cue cards yourself for this one, for your Japan case study and your Nepal case study. You can see the secondary effects on the left hand side for Japan, and then Nepal's secondary effects are on the right hand side. And try and think about why they are so different. So why in an LIC will there be millions left homeless rather than thousands? You want to think about which were the most severe effects, and I have highlighted my thoughts there in orange about the ones that are the most severe, but you might have different opinions. And also, you may want to consider, are they economic, are they social, or are they environmental impacts? So pause here and make your cue cards with the questions on one side and the answers on the other. And once you've completed this, we're moving on to the responses. So firstly, short-term responses. In Kobe, Japan on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, your short-term response in Nepal. And you'll see that there's quite a big contrast where Nepal was very reliant on aid from other countries, whereas the Japanese government rejected offers of aid from other countries. So something to be thinking about again, which do you think were the most successful and reasons why? And you'll want to pause here and again make your cue cards with your questions on one side, your answers on the other for Japan and for Nepal. And now moving on to the long-term response, so those happenings in the months, the years, even after the event happened, and you can see there the long-term responses differ quite significantly between Japan and Nepal. So these will be your final facts to add to your cue cards. Make sure you don't miss any and make sure you have got all those key facts, figures and information included in those. You should now have 2 packs of cue cards, one for your HIC and one for your LIC. You can use these at any point to go back and to revise. You can even do it as a quiz to test someone else, and that can help you because you'll be teaching that information, or you can test yourself. There's loads of ways to use those cue cards successfully. Make sure you keep them somewhere safe, put them in a revision folder. You don't want to lose them after having spent so much time putting them together. Or you might have found it very useful and you might feel that actually, although maybe a little bit painful, doing it all over again might really help you to actually remember those facts and figures. The whole point of having learnt all those facts, figures and data is to answer exam questions. So I'm going to show you some examples of 9 markers that might ask you to pull information from those case studies in order to help you to get those full marks. And this is where also knowing the facts and figures is great, but you also need to be able to explain and evaluate both of those case studies, and you'll be able to see some examples in the questions how they want you to do this. So this first question, which we will look at, is for a tectonic hazard you have studied, to what extent do the responses to that hazard vary between LICs and HICs? So what were the differences between the responses between Japan and Nepal? Can you explain the reasons why this might be the case? Make sure you know your facts, your figures and your data. Another question looking at responses, using examples, evaluate the effectiveness of the immediate and long-term responses to a tectonic hazard in countries with contrasting levels of wealth. Again, 9 marks. You may be asked to contrast the effects, that could be primary or secondary or general, so assess the social and economic effects for a tectonic hazard you have studied in areas with contrasting levels of wealth. Or you could just be asked to compare the difference between responses, short and immediate term, or you could be asked to compare the severity of primary versus secondary effects. So there's a huge range of different questions that you might get asked, so you need to make sure that you can back any question up with all of the data that we have just covered. So make sure you know your facts inside out, back to front.